everyone, it's Nina. Thanks so much for joining me today. Today I have the pleasure of featuring the Simon Says Stamp and Lawn Fawn exclusive stamp set, Happy Howlidays. This is a really adorable stamp set that was designed exclusively for Simon Says Stamp by Lawn Fawn. And you can get this for a limited time only over at the Simon Says Stamp shop, and I'll have a link to that down in the video description below. Here's a look at the card that we'll be creating today. I'm going to be creating this cute little scene with these cute little Dutch hounds sitting in the snow. It's really, really cute. And I just love this stamp set. You can see that it has coordinating dies. Of course, all of Lawn Fawn's stamps usually come with coordinating dies, and that's one of the really great things about their stamps. So you're going to be able to cut out all the images included in this set, including some of those really tiny images as well, which is really, really great for building scenes. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to put all of the stamps inside my Misty stamping tool. Now, I didn't end up using all of the stamps. I wasn't sure really which ones I wanted to use because I thought they were all adorable. And I was like, well, why don't I just stamp them all at once? So I stamped them all, and then the ones that I didn't use, I'll end up setting aside for another card later on. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start by coloring in my critters. Start with the dogs. I put down a light bit of brown on their noses and also on the areas on their paws and also on their belly. I looked at pictures of a Dutch hound on Google, and I found that a lot of them have this little brown area in different parts of their body, especially on their faces and their feet and also on their belly. So I wanted to make sure I incorporated that into my coloring. I ended up bringing in some darker brown then to start shading that in, and I'm feathering it along the edges. I'm making sure I leave a little bit of a highlight for that light area of the brown. I'm going to bring in some darker colors, and I'm feathering those darker grays, which are toner grays, but you can use cool grays, warm grays, whatever ones you want. But I'm just feathering those grays into the browns, and that's going to help blend the two together. And you'll notice that the lighter brown ends up kind of bleaching back the color on some of the dogs because it has so much of the colorless blender in it. It's such a light color, so it kind of almost eats at the darker color. So you can see here as I'm adding that lighter color, it's kind of bleaching those areas where it meets the gray. But I just feather in some of the darker colors, and that ends up kind of smoothing that out and getting rid of that bleeding area. So I'll go ahead and continue coloring in the other dog. You can see I colored in a brown dog the same way that I did the gray ones. And that's because I wasn't sure, again, like I said, if I was going to use that dog. And if I was going to want him a different color because Dutch hounds are all different. So I wanted to make sure I had one that was a different color tone. So after I finish coloring in the dogs, it's time to move on to some of the other elements. I'm going to color in the present with some green Copic markers. And I'm doing very simple shading here to color in the rest of the images. Because they're quite small, you don't want to get too detailed because it allows your coloring to start to bleed outside the lines, especially when you're coloring things like reds, as I'm doing here. So I'm just, again, like I said, being careful not to get too heavy-handed with my shading. I wasn't too worried about a light source in this particular case, and I'm just kind of having fun as I color along with these different colors. Moving on to the present once again, I'm just adding in some darker shading. I let that green sit for a little bit before I went back in with the darker greens. Now for the bone, I just wanted it to have some simple shading, so I used a warm gray marker to just add some areas where it would be darkest, and I let it go at that. I didn't even blend it out. I'm going to color in the present with just some simple coloring using some greens and reds, and then I'll go ahead and color in this little gingerbread man using some of the same browns that I used in the dogs. I didn't introduce too many new colors to the coloring of these particular images, and that's because I had so many colors already, and I was going to be adding colors in from the scene around them that I didn't want the coloring to be distracting and have so many different color tones. So I'm sticking to a lot of the same colors, and I did introduce one or two new colors, especially when I went to color in those scarves and the hat, but again, I didn't end up using those, so that was fine. Now it's time to go ahead and start building my scene. I'm going to die cut this forest border from Lawn Fawn from some white cardstock, and I'll just go ahead and remove that. And you can see it leaves this great border around the edges of the paper that has this little forest. It's really, really adorable. I love this die. I'm also going to take one of the stitched hillside border dies from Lawn Fawn and cut a little snowy hill. It's going to sit in front of my little puppies, and then I'll end up cutting a second one in a little bit, and I'll show you that in a minute. Now here I'm taking a pretty pink posh scalloped rectangle die, and I'm going to die cut this watercolor paper using this die. Now you can see here I've got multiples of all the things that I'm using in my scenes, and that's because I was creating multiples of this particular card design. I'm only showing you one, but I did end up creating more than one of this particular card. Here you can see we're going to need that middle piece of the scalloped rectangle. Normally you would get rid of that, that's the negative portion, but we're going to need that for this particular card, and we're going to need the scalloped rectangle. Now I'm going to bring in this background stamp from Lawn Fawn. This is a really cool background that has a bunch of stars and dots, kind of like snow falling. This is a really cool set. It has also some really neat sentiments. So I'm going to go ahead and mount this into my MISTI stamping tool along with the negative portion of that scalloped rectangle. And what we're going to be doing with this scalloped rectangle is creating the background for our scene. So once I've got that mounted into my MISTI stamping tool, I'm going to go ahead and take my EK Success powder tool and put that on top of the paper because we're going to do some heat embossing here. Once I have that prepped, I'm going to take my Simon Says Stamp Clear Embossing ink and ink up this stamp really well before I go ahead and press it down onto my watercolor paper. Once I've stamped that down, I'm going to go ahead and take some Ranger Superfine White Embossing Powder, and I'll go ahead and sprinkle this all over the stars and dots that are in the sky. And once the embossing powder has been applied onto the paper, I'll go ahead and take my heat gun and heat set those images. Next, it's time to do some embossed resist. This is going to allow us to create this really cool sky in the background of our scene. I'm taking some Tumbled Glass Distress ink and I'm sponging this onto the bottom portion of the panel, bringing it up towards the top, but I'm not going to end up taking it all the way up to the top. I just want it to go part way up the top. Next, I'm going to bring in some Salty Ocean, and I'm going to put that along the top portion, blending it down towards the bottom area where we put the tumbled glass. However, this particular time, I don't want to go all the way down because I want that lighter color to still be able to show through in my scene. So I'm only going part way down, and I'm kind of focusing a lot of the shading on the left and right sides and kind of having like almost like an arc of lighter color in the center. And then I'm going to bring in some Blueprint Sketch Distress ink and do the same thing that I did with the Salty Ocean. However, I'm not going to go quite as far on this round. And then after I've blended that Blueprint Sketch, I'm going to take my Distress Sprayer, and you can see here my multiples that I've created. I'm doing them all at the same time to save me some time in the creation process. I'm taking a Distress Sprayer, like I said, and I'm spritzing on a bunch of water droplets. And that's going to create a really cool effect in the sky, kind of give it that little bit of a galaxy look. And I'll lift off that water after I let it sit for about 30 seconds. I'll lift it off and dry the paper to make sure it's completely dry before we move on to adding a second layer of distress ink. Now, you may be wondering why I'm going to do a second layer of distress ink, and that's because I love vibrancy and really bright colors in my card making. And when you do multiple layers of distress ink, that's going to give you a lot more vibrant result. You can already see here I've added a second layer of Salty Ocean, and now I'm bringing in some Blueprint Sketch. And you can already see how much more vibrant it is on this piece compared to the piece up at the top right. And then here are all of them all finished. The vibrancy is so much more impactful on this second layer. And you could even go even further and add a third layer. I didn't do it for this particular card, but I have done it in the past, and it really does make a difference. I'm going to go ahead and do the same splatter technique to add a little bit more texture to the sky, and then I'll go ahead and dry those panels once again. Moving on to our little forest border die, I'm going to add some color using some Mowed Lawn Distress ink, and I'm being careful when I'm applying this distress ink down because these trees are very delicate, so I don't want to wreck them or worse, rip them off of the paper. So I'm just being very careful, and I'm kind of pulling up from the bottom of the trees up towards the top, and that's kind of helping me keep them in place and not shift. I'm going to now bring in some pine needles, and I'm going to sporadically add this to the trees. I don't want them to be completely covered with this pine needles. I just want to add a little bit of extra color into these trees. Here I'm laying this over top of my scene. You can see how it's going to look really cool. And you could use this for non-winter scenes. It would be really cute. But of course, this is going to be a winter scene, so we're going to move on and start building the rest of this particular scene. I'm going to bring in that scalloped rectangle die, and I'm going to nest this over top of the scalloped panel that we have from the negative portion of this rectangle, and I'm lining up the forest border die where I'm going to want it on the finished card. So right there is where I'm going to want it, and I'm going to run this through my die cutting machine. And what this is going to do is once I've run this through, this forest border will have the scallop detail from the negative portion cut into this particular paper. And that's going to allow us to nest this right on top of our scallop panel and make sure that it has the exact same edge as the panel that it's sitting on top of. I'm going to repeat this same process with all of the pieces that I'm going to be layering up on top of my scene. So I'm going to go ahead and take that little snowy white border that I created from the Stitch Hillside border dies, and I'll do the exact same thing like I said, picking up that little hill after nesting it where I'm going to want it and making sure that my scalloped rectangle die was lined up perfectly as well. Now I'm going to take that hillside border that is a slope. It matches up perfectly with the forest border, and I'm going to die cut that from some white cardstock as well. I'm going to again line this up once more, and I'm going to do the exact same thing where I added the scalloped rectangle die right back on top and making sure I get it nested in place. Once I have everything die cut, you can see how perfectly this ends up working out and how it nests perfectly right on top of our little scene. And that's going to allow us to end up creating our finished card because we're going to be adding that scalloped rectangle over top of this, but it's not going to be laid flush, it's going to be popped up, and it's also going to be at a slightly lower dimension than the topmost layer of our scene. So there's a lot of layers going on in this particular card, and this is why I wanted to make sure that my scene elements had that negative scallop border on here. I attached the forest border with some ATG adhesive, and now I'm taking some foam tape and applying that to the back side of one of the hill dies that we created. Next, I'm going to take some more foam tape and I'm going to add it to the back side of our frontmost snowy hill, and I'll attach that right there along the bottom portion. Now I lost the footage of how I applied these little critters down onto my scene, but basically what I did was I attached the critters with a combination of liquid glue and foam tape, and I just layered them on top of each other behind the little frontmost snowy hill, and also some of the pieces are on top. Now I'm taking right here a wood grain background stamp from Hero Arts and some Neenah Desert Storm cardstock. And I'm inked up the wood grain background with some Simon Says Stamp clear ink, and I'm going to take that Neenah cardstock base and lay it right there on top of my wood grain stamp. I'm using a piece of scrap paper so I don't get ink on my hands, and there you can see that great tone-on-tone effect that we get by stamping with the clear embossing ink. We're not going to actually end up heat setting this. I just wanted to make sure that I get that nice watermark effect, because that's one thing that the heat embossing ink will end up doing for you, is that you can create cool watermark effects or tone-on-tone stamping. Now, meanwhile, as I'm blabbering about here, I have a piece of foam tape and I'm just cutting that down into thirds. And I'm using those thirds to add along the edges of my little scalloped rectangle here. And then I'm going to go ahead and pop this up right into the center of our card base. Now this card base is slightly larger than an A2 size card, not by much. I think it's 1/4 of an inch larger on each side. So if you are going to create this card exactly the way I did, you will end up needing a slightly larger envelope to go ahead and mail this. Next, I'm going to take my little seam panel here and I'm going to nest it right inside the scalloped rectangle. And I'm going to take a few Copic markers in some light blues, and one of them is also going to be in a light purple. I'm going to add a bunch of dots, or stippling as the correct term for it is. I'm just adding this to add a little bit of shading to my snow and kind of give it a little bit more extra dimension. Snow, of course, is not pure white. It does have shadows, so adding in these little dot stippling effects will end up helping the snow look a little bit more realistic. For some embellishment, I'm taking some Spectrum Noir Clear Overlay Sparkle Pen. This is basically a clear sparkle brush, and I'm applying it onto the ribbons, and also I'm going to add it to the snow. And then I even ended up putting some of it onto the water spots of my sky, because I thought this would help give the sky a little bit more of a nighttime feel, kind of like stars in the distance. Now for my sentiment, I'm going to stamp this portion of it in some Schoolhouse Red ink from Simon Says Stamp, and then I'll go ahead and finish it off with this little portion of the sentiment and use some slate gray ink to go ahead and press that down. Once I've inked those up and stamped the sentiment, I'm going to take my fine tip scissors from Cutter Bee and trim this sentiment out so it's finished off and has this nice little white edge around it to help it stand off of the background. I'll pop that up with some foam tape, and then I'll go ahead and move on to adding a couple more embellishments. I used some baker's twine along the top portion of this card. This is some red and white striped baker's twine, and I just wrapped it around the top portion of my card a couple times, tied it into a little bow, and now I'm going to take some PPA matte adhesive or any other liquid glue you prefer, and I'll just go ahead and put a dot of glue behind the bow, and that's going to help hold it in place, make sure it doesn't shift. For the final bit of embellishing, I'm going to take some glossy accents and add it to the ribbons on the presents and also onto the noses and eyes of the dogs. So I hope you've enjoyed this look and inspiration on using the new Lawn Fawn Happy Holidays stamp set that is exclusive to Simon Says Stamp. Be sure to head on over to the Simon Says Stamp blog where you can get more information on this card, including still pictures and products used. And also make sure that you head on over to the Simon Says Stamp shop where you can get your copy of the new Happy Holidays stamp set. Remember, this is a limited time only stamp set, so once it's gone, it's not getting reordered. So make sure you grab yours now. Be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.